The policy of détente, which emerged in the late 1960s and continued through the 1970s, represented a significant shift in the Cold War dynamics between the United States and the Soviet Union. After years of intense rivalry and the constant threat of nuclear conflict, both superpowers recognized the practical necessity of easing tensions. The relentless arms race and the ever-present possibility of a nuclear war had created an atmosphere of fear and instability, making it clear that some form of rapprochement was in the best interests of both nations. Détente was not driven by idealism, but by a pragmatic understanding that neither side could afford the costs and risks associated with perpetual confrontation. One of the most concrete manifestations of détente was the agreement to reduce the vast arsenals of nuclear weapons that both the United States and the Soviet Union had accumulated. This effort began with the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, which sought to curb the arms race that had defined much of the Cold War. In 1972, after extensive negotiations, the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, known as SALT I, was signed by U.S. President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev. SALT I was a landmark agreement that placed limits on the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles, SLBMs, that each side could possess. It also included the Anti-Ballistic Missile, ABM, Treaty, which restricted the deployment of missile defense systems that could potentially undermine the principle of mutually assured destruction, MAD, a key factor in deterring a nuclear war. The success of SALT I was followed by further efforts to solidify détente through increased cooperation and dialogue. In 1975, the Helsinki Accords were signed at the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE. The Helsinki Agreement was a comprehensive set of commitments made by 35 nations, including the United States, the Soviet Union, and most European countries, aimed at improving relations between the Eastern and Western blocs. The Accords addressed a wide range of issues, including security, economic cooperation, and human rights. While the agreement did not have the force of a binding treaty, it was significant in that it established a framework for dialogue and cooperation, and it implicitly acknowledged the existing borders in Europe, which was a crucial concern for the Soviet Union. Importantly, the human rights provisions of the Helsinki Accords provided a basis for future dissident movements in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, challenging the repressive policies of communist regimes. Despite these positive developments, the policy of détente faced significant challenges, particularly as the decade wore on. The Second Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT II, was negotiated in the mid-1970s and signed by U.S. President Jimmy Carter and Soviet Premier Brezhnev in 1979. SALT II sought to build on the progress of SALT I by further limiting the number of strategic nuclear delivery systems, including ICBMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers. However, the treaty faced strong opposition in the United States, where critics argued that it gave too much advantage to the Soviet Union and did not do enough to curb the arms race. The Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 dealt a severe blow to détente, leading to the U.S. Senate's refusal to ratify SALT II and marking a significant downturn in U.S.-Soviet relations. Despite the setbacks, the era of détente had lasting impacts on the Cold War. It demonstrated that the superpowers could engage in dialogue and negotiate agreements that served their mutual interests, reducing the immediate risk of conflict. The arms control agreements and the Helsinki Accords laid the groundwork for future negotiations and provided a framework that would eventually contribute to the end of the Cold War. While détente did not eliminate the deep-seated ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union, it marked a period where practical considerations took precedence over confrontation, showing that even in an era of intense rivalry, cooperation was possible and desirable.